I almost didn't tell this story. For a long time, I convinced myself it wasn't worth telling, that maybe I was being too sensitive, too proud, or just a bitter old woman who couldn't let things go. But then, I thought about all the years I spent swallowing things that should have been said out loud, and I decided that the truth deserves a voice, even when it comes late. My name is Eleanor. I'm 63 years old. I live in a small house in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I raised my son, my beautiful, brilliant son Curtis, almost entirely on my own. His father, my husband Raymond, passed away from a stroke when Curtis was 11 years old. I was 38 at the time, still young enough that people told me I'd find someone else, old enough to know I wouldn't. Raymond was the kind of man you only get once in a lifetime, and after he was gone, I poured every single thing I had left into our son. I worked 2 jobs for years. I was a dental hygienist during the week, and I cleaned offices on Friday and Saturday nights. I'm not telling you that for sympathy. I'm telling you because it matters to what comes later. Every dollar I didn't spend on myself went somewhere. Some of it went to Curtis's baseball fees, his school trips, his first car. But some of it, a good portion of it, actually, went somewhere else entirely. I'll get to that. Curtis grew up well. He was kind, he was hardworking, he got a degree in civil engineering from the University of Tennessee and landed a solid job in Charlotte, North Carolina. I cried the day he drove away. Not because I was sad exactly, but because Raymond would have been so proud. I called his father's grave that night. I know that sounds strange, but I do that sometimes, and I just said, "We did it, Ray. He's going to be okay." For a while, things were good. Curtis called regularly. He came home for Thanksgiving and Christmas. We had our rhythms. Then, about 3 years ago, he told me he'd met someone. Her name was Tiffany Beaumont. He was excited when he told me about her. His voice had this lightness to it that I hadn't heard in a long time, and a mother notices those things. I was happy for him. I really was. I asked all the right questions. Where did she grow up? What does she do? Is she good to you? He said she was from Raleigh, that she worked in marketing, and that yes, she was wonderful. I held on to that word. Wonderful. I believed him. The first time I met Tiffany was at a restaurant in Charlotte about 6 months after they started dating. Curtis had picked a nice place, white tablecloths, the kind of menu where nothing has a price next to it. I wore my good blue dress, the one I save for occasions. I got there early, the way I always do, and I sat at the table and waited. They came in together, and I stood up and smiled, and Tiffany looked me up and down with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not unfriendly, exactly. More like she was assessing something and had already come to a conclusion. She shook my hand instead of hugging me. That was the first thing I noticed. Over dinner, she spoke mostly to Curtis. When she did speak to me, her questions were polite but surface level. Where did I grow up? Did I still work? What did I do for fun? I answered everything warmly. I asked about her family, her work, her life. She gave short answers and then redirected the conversation. By the time dessert came, I felt like I'd been interviewed for a job I didn't fully understand and hadn't been told whether I'd passed. On the drive home that night, I told myself I was overthinking it. First meetings are awkward. She didn't know me. I didn't know her. Give it time, Eleanor. I gave it time. Over the next year, Curtis and Tiffany came to Knoxville twice. Both times I cooked full meals. Pot roast, green beans from the garden, sweet potato pie from Raymond's mother's recipe. Tiffany ate small amounts and said things like, "It's very homey," which I think was meant as a compliment but didn't always land like one. She spent a lot of time on her phone. She wasn't cruel. I want to make that clear. She was just elsewhere. Like she was visiting a place she didn't fully belong and counting the hours until she could leave. I noticed the way she reacted when I brought out old photo albums. She'd glance at pictures of Curtis as a boy and smile politely. The way you smile at someone else's child's crayon drawing. Technically appreciative, actually disinterested. I noticed the way she steered Curtis away from long conversations with me. A hand on his arm, a look, a sudden pressing need to check on something in the car. Small things. Each one forgivable on its own. Together, they started to add up. Curtis proposed to Tiffany on New Year's Eve of last year. He called me the next morning. and the joy in his voice was so real and so full that I pushed everything else aside and just let myself be happy with him. "Mom," she said. "Yes," he said, and he sounded like he was 12 years old again, and I laughed and cried at the same time, and told him Raymond would have been over the moon. The wedding planning was where things began to unravel. Tiffany's mother, a woman named Barbara Beaumont, was very involved. I expected that. What I didn't expect was how completely invisible I would become in the process. When I offered to help with anything, flowers, the rehearsal dinner, even just addressing envelopes, there was always a reason it wasn't necessary. "We've already handled that." Or, "Tiffany has a vision, so we're trying to keep the aesthetic consistent." Or, most often, silence that lasted just a little too long before Curtis jumped in to smooth things over. The rehearsal dinner was the first time I truly felt the walls close in. Tiffany's family had rented a private room at a steakhouse in Charlotte. I drove up the night before and checked into a hotel. I hadn't been asked to stay at the apartment, which I didn't take personally, or at least I tried not to. At the dinner, the seating arrangement put me at the far end of the table with two of Tiffany's cousins I'd never met, while Curtis sat at the center with Tiffany and both sets of her parents, Barbara and her ex-husband Gerald Beaumont, who had since remarried. Both of those couples sat at the main table. I, the mother of the groom, the only living parent Curtis had, sat at the end with those cousins. I didn't say anything. I smiled through it. I ate my steak and talked to the cousins and told myself it was a seating chart, not a verdict. But I think some part of me knew. The wedding itself was beautiful. I have to say that honestly, Tiffany had taste, and the venue, a renovated barn outside Charlotte, was genuinely lovely. White string lights, wooden arches, wildflowers everywhere. Curtis looked like his father in his suit. That almost broke me open right there in the front row. I had brought my gift to the reception. It was a plain white envelope, not wrapped, not in a fancy box. I'd written Curtis and Tiffany's names on the outside in my best handwriting and sealed it carefully. I had prepared it months in advance, actually, long before the invitations went out, long before the venue was booked. I had started preparing it years before, truthfully, but I'll explain that in a moment. The gift table was crowded with beautifully wrapped packages. Silver paper, gold ribbon, boxes from department stores with the logos facing out. My envelope looked humble by comparison. I knew that. I set it on the table near the back and stepped away. I was standing near the bar, talking to Curtis's college roommate, a young man named Patrick, when I saw it happen. Tiffany was making her rounds at the gift table with her maid of honor, a woman named Chelsea. And the two of them were murmuring to each other, turning packages over, reading cards. Then Tiffany picked up my envelope. She turned it over, squeezed it lightly, and I saw her mouth something to Chelsea. Chelsea laughed. Tiffany set the envelope back down. Or I thought she did. But a few minutes later, I walked past the table and the envelope was gone. I didn't see where it went at first. Then I saw the small wastebasket near the edge of the gift table. It had been set there for torn wrapping paper and ribbon, and sitting on top of a crumpled piece of silver tissue paper, neatly and deliberately placed, was my white envelope. I stood there for a moment. Just a moment. I don't know what I looked like from the outside. I hope I looked neutral. On the inside, I felt something I can only describe as the ground shifting. Not falling, not dramatic, just a quiet, irreversible tilt, like a door closing. I reached down and took the envelope from the wastebasket. I tucked it into my purse. I walked to the restroom, stood at the sink for a few minutes, looked at my reflection. And then I went back to the reception, and I danced with Curtis when the DJ played an old Stevie Wonder song. And I smiled, and I meant it. Because even in the middle of something painful, my son was happy, and that was real. I drove home to Knoxville the next morning. I didn't tell Curtis what I had seen. Now let me tell you about the envelope. When Raymond died, we had a small life insurance policy. Not enormous, but enough that I didn't have to move or take Curtis out of his school immediately. I used most of it over the years. But there was one thing Raymond had said to me, near the end, when we didn't know it was the end, but some part of us must have sensed it. He said, "Eleanor, whatever you do, put something away that no one can touch. Put it somewhere safe and let it grow, and don't touch it no matter what. Promise me." I promised him. Raymond had grown up with nothing. He had a deep, bone-level belief that real security came from owning land. Not stocks, not savings accounts, land. They can print more money, he used to say. They can't print more acres. So starting the year after he died, I put money aside. Not much at first, $50 a month, sometimes less. But I put it aside faithfully. Over the years, as Curtis grew and my cleaning job became more consistent, and my hygienist salary got small cost of living bumps, the amount I set aside grew too. I kept it in a dedicated savings account I didn't touch, didn't borrow from, didn't tell anyone about. 15 years ago, I used it to buy a small piece of property, 2 acres and a simple house, on the edge of a suburb outside Knoxville, in an area that was quiet and affordable then. I paid cash, every cent from that account. I rented the house out over the years and used the rental income to keep the property maintained. And then, in the years since Curtis started talking about settling down, since he mentioned Charlotte, since he brought up Tiffany, I watched that area outside Knoxville and I started to think. The town had grown, the suburb had grown, a development company had bought up surrounding parcels and built a new neighborhood. Property values in that corridor had gone up significantly. I had the house appraised last spring. It came back at $340,000. That is what was in the envelope. The deed to that property made out in Curtis's name, along with a letter I had written explaining the history. Raymond's wish, the decades of saving, the rental years, the growth, and a handwritten note at the bottom that said, "This is from your father and from me. It is yours. Build something good." That is what Tiffany Beaumont dropped into a wastebasket at her own wedding reception. I didn't say anything for 3 weeks. Curtis called to thank me for coming, and I said, of course, and I asked if they had a good time on their honeymoon in Costa Rica, and I listened to him talk about the zip lines and the food and the rainforest. I didn't mention the envelope. Then, one evening, my phone rang. It was Tiffany. She had never called me before. Not once, in 2 years of knowing each other. She called from her own number, not Curtis's, which told me she'd made a decision to reach out on her own. She said hello, asked how I was doing. I said I was fine. Then there was a pause and she said, "Eleanor, I have to ask you something, and I want you to know I'm not trying to start any drama. Curtis mentioned that you may have left a gift at the reception, and we're going through everything now and we don't see anything from you. We got a card from you in the mail the week before, so we assumed that was it. But Curtis feels bad and wanted me to check." I sat very still on my couch. She had told Curtis there was nothing from me, and now she was calling to inquire, carefully, because she needed to understand what had happened to whatever she had thrown away. I said, "Yes, Tiffany, I did leave a gift at the reception." She said, "Oh, and what was it if you don't mind me asking? Because we truly can't locate it and I want to make sure it didn't get lost in the shuffle." I paused for a moment, just a breath. Then I said, "It was an envelope, plain white. I set it on the gift table. I saw you pick it up, and I saw where it went after that. I retrieved it before I left that evening." The silence on her end lasted a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was different, quieter, careful. She said, "Eleanor, I think there may have been a misunderstanding." I said, "There wasn't." Another silence. She said, "Was there something important in the envelope?" And I said, "Yes, there was." I didn't tell her what it was. Not that night. I let her sit with not knowing. I think that was the right thing to do, and I'm not ashamed of it. Curtis called me the next morning. I could tell by his voice that Tiffany had told him, at least partially. He sounded shaken, and also like he was trying very hard to stay calm. He asked me what had been in the envelope. I told him everything. Raymond's promise, the savings, the property, the appraisal, all of it. I read him the letter I had written. By the time I finished, he was crying. He said, "Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't know she did that. I swear I didn't know." I believed him. I do believe him. But I also said gently, "Curtis, there have been other things, not just this. I've let a lot go over 2 years because I didn't want to come between you and your happiness. But this was the last one." He asked what I meant. So I told him. I told him about the rehearsal dinner seating. About the times I'd offered to help and been quietly shut out. About the looks, the redirections, the way Tiffany made me feel like a guest in my own son's life. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Raymond taught him, to listen until someone is actually finished. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What are you going to do with the property?" I told him I hadn't decided yet. The truth is, I had decided. I just wasn't ready to say it out loud. Tiffany called me 2 days later. This time, she didn't dance around it. She apologized, genuinely, I think, though I also think the apology had more than a little fear mixed into it. She said she'd made assumptions, and she'd been wrong, and she was deeply sorry. She cried. I listened. I said I appreciated her calling. I did not say I forgave her, not because I'm a hard woman. I'm not, really, but because forgiveness isn't a light switch. It doesn't turn on because someone finally understands what they threw away. Barbara Beaumont, Tiffany's mother, called me a week later. That surprised me more than anything else in this whole story. Honestly, Barbara is a polished woman. Very composed, very social. But she called and she said, "Eleanor, I want you to know that Tiffany's behavior at that reception was not how she was raised. Gerald and I are embarrassed. We are working with her on this. I hope you'll allow some time for her to make it right with you and with Curtis." There was something in that call that reached me in a way Tiffany's apology hadn't quite managed to. Maybe because Barbara didn't have to call. She didn't stand to gain anything directly from the call. She was just a mother who raised a daughter who made a serious mistake and was trying, in her own way, to account for it. I thanked Barbara. I told her I respected her for calling. As for the property, I've decided to put it in a trust. Not Curtis's name, not jointly, not in anyone else's name yet. A trust managed by me with a clear set of conditions. My attorney, a woman named Harriet Odom who's been handling my affairs for over a decade, helped me structure it properly. The property and its value are protected. What happens with it next will depend on what the next few years look like. What kind of relationship is built? What kind of effort is made? What kind of woman Tiffany Beaumont decides to be going forward? I'm not punishing anyone. I want to be clear about that. I'm not sitting in Knoxville sharpening some grudge. I'm just a woman who made a promise to her late husband, kept it for 30 years, and wasn't willing to hand the result of all that keeping to someone who couldn't see its value long enough to carry it from a gift table to her car. What I told Curtis the last time we talked was this: I love you without condition. The property is a different matter. Conditions apply there, and I think that's fair. He said he understood. I think he does. Some mornings I sit on my porch with my coffee. I take it with a lot of cream, I always have. And I think about Raymond. About the way he used to say you can't print more acres. About the 2 years he worked at a factory in Chattanooga before we met, saving every dollar he could because he believed that owning something, really owning it, was the only kind of freedom that lasted. He didn't live to see the property become what it is. He didn't live to see Curtis in that suit at the wedding, looking so much like his father it could stop your heart. He didn't live to see any of this, and some days that grief is very fresh, even after 22 years. But he also didn't live to see his life's philosophy proven wrong. And that matters to me more than people might expect. I'm not a dramatic woman. I don't tell this story at dinner parties or to my coworkers. I told it here, to you, because I think there are people listening who have spent their lives putting something away faithfully. Not just money, but time, love, patience, second chances, and who have had it picked up and dismissed by someone who didn't take a moment to understand what they were holding. And I want those people to know, take it back. Whatever it is, take it back and decide, on your own terms, what happens to it next. That's what I did, and I sleep fine.